protesting against anti-Asian racism. And I believe today is one symbolic step that we have walked as a community, as one people against systemic racism. Somehow take back, quote unquote, your country. No, this country belongs to the 85.
6 Asian women were murdered on Tuesday and let's get it right, an anti-Asian hate crime brought on directly as a result of one, the months of racial scapegoating the government pins onto Asian Americans for their own failures with the pandemic. 2, the covering up of our past traumas by the media, because yes, there has been a 150% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes lately.
It breaks my heart.
And hello and welcome to Dialogue. Today we look at anti-Asian discrimination in the U.S. The shooting in Atlanta has placed a spotlight on a growing problem and how the Asian community has suffered stigmatization because of the prejudice and ignorance of some politicians and possibly media, particularly in connection with the coronavirus pandemic. So how is their American dream affected by racism? And how can they better survive and thrive as they simply try to live their normal life? To talk about the issue, I'm joined by Ray Baker, adjunct professor from Towson University, Dr. Yawei Liu, adjunct professor of political science at Emory University, and Sheena Yap Chen, co-author of Asian Women Who Boss Up. That's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. Let me start with you, Mr. Liu. The Atlanta gunman killed 6 women of Asian descent, and he went all the way to target some particular establishment just miles apart. But the local police and even the FBI seemingly don't want to link this shooting with racial discrimination. According to what you know, to what extent do you think this has to do with racial discrimination and hate?
Well, if it's a racial discrimination, it's a little subtle. When you refer to the local law enforcement people, specifically it referred to the spokesperson of the Cherokee County sheriff. You know, when he had his first press briefing, he said the gunman, confessed that he had such a strong sexual desire that he wanted to eliminate the sources, that arouses his sexual desire. He also referred to the gunman, Aaron Long, saying that he had a bad day. And that statement certainly has shocked Asian American community. What do you mean he had a bad day? If he had a bad day, he's going to go out and he's going to kill 6 women of Asian descent and 2 others? That's just not right, and that's not to be tolerated.
But we don't know the exact motivation of this gunman yet. So is it fair now to characterize this as a racial hate crime, Mr. Liu?
I think, there is we can say all we want to say about this is a hate crime against Asian Americans. It's violence against Asian Americans, but the bar is very high in terms of determining that this is racially motivated. I think the way that the spokesperson talks about this is basically to say this is just a normal murder as it was, not a racially motivated desire.
And why Asian women in this case? Sheena Yap Chen, I know that you've been working to help advance the Asian women so they can authentically thrive and live better lives. There's been a call for people to not associate the victims with sex work because it would reinforce what they call hypersexualization of Asian women. What is your take?
Thanks for that question. And for me, this notion that not to include sex workers is still dehumanizing Asian women, because some of them, that's their livelihood. And to live authentically is to just go out there and be who you want to be, right? And if that's what they choose to, that's fine. But there's also Asian women who go to America and Canada and are forced into this work. And so if we leave them out, we're going to dehumanize them again. And it's just another cycle. And for me, to elevate Asian women's voices is we have to learn to speak up. We've been brought up all our lives to never rock the boat, never say anything, just let everything go. And our silence is literally killing us. You know, Asian women are more likely targeted 2.3 times more than men. And if we keep silent, we'll never solve this problem. We'll always become an easy target. And for me, it's learning that all Asian women, regardless of who they are and what they do, we all have to band together and start speaking up for each other, start supporting each other so that we can eliminate what's been going on.
Of course, Ray, the African Americans have also run into similar problems. They are being handled probably disproportionately harshly by the law enforcement. What do you make of this case in Atlanta?
I think the interesting thing that we're tasked with is trying to understand or suss out the motivation of this individual actor. We are better if we think about this not singularly in the motivation of this actor, but is this particular spate of violence against women of Asian descent consistent with ongoing violence in the United States against people of Asian descent? And the answer is yes. If we look at it broadly, then we're finding what's happening here is an intense action against Asian American peoples that results in violence, that results in harm, and more often than not in the United States is perpetrated by those who are acting in the spirit of white supremacy. And so some of the hashtags that have developed in the United States have been things such as the sort of Black Lives Matter or Stop Asian Hate. But what some people are concluding is we don't have to individualize the needs to advocate for the specific groups if we broadly and roundly end white supremacy.
And Mr. Liu, do you think actually white supremacist tendency is behind those acts against Asians and also African Americans?
I think Professor Baker made it very clear that it's crime, violence against Asian Americans, it's crime and violence against Black Americans, it's crime and violence against Latino Americans. These are the groups that are being targeted, and it could be very well linked to white supremacists.
As Ray just mentioned, there are increasing cases of verbal and physical attacks against Asian nowadays, recently in recent months. Can you fathom why this is the case, Mr. Liu?
I think it is the case largely because American leaders, as you mentioned in the lead of the program, some of the media coverage, talk about China virus, Gong flu. And for many Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, they all look alike, and they are all to be perceived as virus-carrying Chinese, and that's why they're being singled out.
So, Sheena, you also believe that what President Trump said during the COVID era about Kung flu and Chinese virus have actually resonated among his supporters and changed their behaviors in a certain way.
Yeah, I believe, using those names really hurt us. We become a target, an easy target, because now there's this model minority myth that, all viruses come from China and that all Asians are Chinese people. And regardless what Asian descent you are, you're going to be targeted because Trump supporters think we're all Chinese. And so this really hurts us. And every time we hear that, it's like a stab in our heart, right? Because some of us have never even been to China, or we're not even associated with what's been going on, but we will be the target of it because of the color of our skin.
But this is still beyond me. How can so many supporters of Trump believe in that this virus associated with certain ethnic groups who are Americans the same as they are? Ray?
So I think what's interesting here is that unfortunately it's not just limited to those supporters of President Trump. those supporters of President Trump have demonstrated themselves to hold and protect values of white supremacy time and again, whether it be their attacks against our Arab American friends, whether it be their attacks against our Latinx friends or African American friends, and obviously here now our Asian friends. But I invite your viewers and listeners to think about the pivot that the Biden administration is making to a new Cold War of sorts between China. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has gone so far to talk about how China is in the crosshairs. And so even what's considered the liberal or progressive wing of the United States politics is still looking at China as an adversarial enemy. And as one of your guests has already alluded to, many Americans, particularly white Americans, but broadly all Americans, don't do the necessary work to differentiate between the various peoples of Asian descent. So should they see a Japanese person, a Chinese person, or a Korean person, their antagonism and the attack goes all the way toward those folks in using some of the anti-Asian hate and anti-English language and, unfortunately, anti-Asian violence. And so what we have to understand here is that the United States is functionally otherizing those men and women and persons from the Asian community, be they all sorts of ethnic communities, and whether it's a soft aggression of the Biden administration and now a new Cold War, or whether it's the overt racism of Trump supporters and the Kung flu and the China virus, it all materializes as hate, harassment, and violence against our Asian American friends.
Are you saying that the American leadership are partially responsible for those discriminations and even hatred against certain ethnic groups?
So I'm not saying the responsibility lies on American leadership. I am saying that the American leadership is laying out the context and providing what could be fertile ground for the violent nature of Americans to take shape. Consider this: the United States has been at war for nearly 90% of its time in existence. So violence is the currency and language with which Americans speak. So if you sow that fertile ground of violence with animus toward a group that's deemed as the other, and in this case, the other is our Asian American friends, then that violence will now unfold and unveil itself onto those Asian American people.
Mr. Liu, I know that you and your wife have laid flowers to honor those killed in Atlanta and express your condolences. Can you set the scene for us? What is it like in those places?
Well, we went to the one on the suburb of Atlanta in a place called Ackworth in Cherokee County. You know, this is the Yang's Massage, owned and run by a Chinese immigrant from Nanjing. You know, a friend of mine called and said, would you like to go and visit her survivors, you know, family members, and lay flowers? And of course, I said yes. So we drove about 70 kilometers, you know, to the place. And to the surprise of us, you know, there are lots of flowers there. There are lots of people there, and people that we don't know. And there are
just
lots of
Asians or
reporters,
other
you know,
ethnic
media
groups
people
also
like you.
visiting and showing their sympathy?
No, there are Asian Chinese Americans like me. There are Korean Americans. There are Hispanic Americans. There are Black Americans. There are media, New York Times, CNN people. They're all down there. The question they asked when we got there is, you know, are you related to Tan Xiaojie? And we said, no, we're not related. We don't know her, but, you know, she's a member of our community. We're here to mourn her death. We're here to mourn, you know, the shooting down of a dream of a person, you know, who want to be better and to improve her life and to visit the whole world.
I want to look at it at a broader context. How Asians have been doing in the United States. Do you believe there is systemic racism against Asians as African Americans in the United States, Mr. Liu?
No, I think as an Asian American, as a Chinese American, you know, my experience is, you know, I'm from school to school. I went to school here. I worked at school, and then I work at a place where, you know, people are very sensitive to issues of racism. So if I've been discriminated, it could be very subtle. It could be in a way that when promotion happens, it could be in the way of, you know, salary promotion and things like that. So I don't encounter, you know, naked racism on a daily basis. Where I've been working, you know, people are very sensitive to the issue. So it varies from people to people. It depends on where you work. It depends on what kind of occupation you're part of.
And Sheena, what about you? What is your sense of whether Asians are treated differently in America?
Well, for me, as an Asian woman, I live in Canada, and I have gone through some things where I have been treated differently because of it. Because I'm Asian, right? Some of the things we went through as a family was going to a restaurant and not being treated properly because of the color of our skin. I remember going into an IHOP, and the waitress serviced all the other ccustomers who were Caucasian. We sat first before them, but they got treated way better than us. And I remember my mother being asked by the hostess. The hostess asked her if we had a great time, and she was like, "No, we didn't. It's probably because the color of our skin." And even for me, just walking into a coffee shop alone and being that only Asian person still gives me some anxiety, because it's like you don't know what's going to happen. Everyone else is Caucasian, and then you're the only Asian person inside. It really does take a toll sometimes when you go in. And so for me, I haven't gone through like severe racist attacks compared to some of the other women, but I know it happens. I've talked to a lot of women who've gone through it, being spat on the subway, being sexually harassed. And just because I haven't gone through it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It happens all the time. And in Canada, it's more of a polite racism, right? They look at you and they're like, "Oh, you look like Beth," because Beth is Asian, which is really uncalled for. It's really offensive. Just because we're Asian doesn't mean we look alike. We just may have the same cultural background, but that's it. And so, it does happen. I even had an aunt here in Canada who recently who also got spat on by a bunch of kids and getting called racial slurs. So it does happen. And just because we don't hear about it doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
And Ray, of course it's understandable because America is a melting pot, people of different ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. Maybe there are stereotypes here and there, but to attack and assault certain races because their color, because where they come from, this is really another cup of tea.
It is, but unfortunately, it's very American. So you see, we have to consider that Americans did this to one another upon the founding of this nation. In the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, when women were trying to advocate for their own personal rights, one of the things they said was that women were being denied the right to vote when the right to vote was being even given to a foreigner. Those foreigners they were talking about were other white people, other Europeans. And so what we know is that ever since the United States became the country that it sees itself as today, since those founding fathers that are so often revered so dearly, there's always been an otherization of anyone who wasn't initially Anglo, but that then grew to be anyone who was not white. And now what we're finding is that our Asian American community is violently attacked because of it. Let's also revisit the question that you asked to your other panelists. Are folks experiencing systemic racism? I appreciate and think it's valuable the interpersonal examples of racism that your panelists talked about, because those are important to consider. But when we begin to talk about systemic patterns, we can look at the fact that Asian women or Asian men, what kind of money they are making compared to their white counterparts. We can look at the fact of what kind of promotions they're getting compared to their white counterparts. One of the things that we know is that the coronavirus and pandemic has been so aggressively terrible for our Pacific Islander community here in the United States that the unemployment rate has dropped below that of white Americans in regards to the effects of the coronavirus. But that's not always talked about when we discuss the persons of Asian descent or our Asian American community here in the United States. So those are ways that structural racism are adversely impacting those from the Asian American community in a myriad of different ways. Lastly, and very briefly, it's important to remember the idea that one of your panelists alluded to earlier about the model minority myth. The model minority was an example of admitting and bringing in a particular class of Far East Asian Americans to be scholars, to be professionals, to hold those folks up as exemplars of the American way, to point them into direct contrast of African Americans in their quest for social justice in the civil rights movements of the 1960s. Because in large part, in western part of the United States, there was a great deal of solidarity among the Asian American community and the Black American community, and in an effort to interrupt that that solidarity. In an effort to disrupt that, they hold up Asian Americans in a very anti-black way, but it also dehumanizes and limits the lived experience and structural racism that Asian Americans face in this country.
Mr. Liu, President Biden has been calling on the U.S. to unite against hate and speak out against the violence targeting Asian Americans. And he also for racial equality between different groups. But the problem is, as Ray said, what about those deep structural racism that is hidden there? And what is the way to tackle the problem?
Well, it's a long road ahead. President Biden and the Vice President Harris, they came down to Atlanta. They came to my university and met with Asian American community leaders. He delivered a very strong speech, and he said he wanted his colleagues in Congress, to pass a COVID-19 and others can be better protected. Things like this has been ongoing for a long time. It's going to take, I don't know, another decade or even half a century, to totally eliminate structural racism, as was mentioned by Professor Baker in his remarks.
We've also collected some opinions from social media users on the Atlanta shooting. Let's take a look at some of them. This one, Ni Hao Kailan, she said, the worst part about the Stop Asian Hate movement is knowing that there are specific people who are directly responsible for these deaths. Politicians who said Chinese virus made this violence and racism socially acceptable. About the narratives and the media coverage on China and probably Chinese and Asians to a larger extent. Ray, what do you think those narratives have been contributing to what some Americans think about their Asian fellow citizens?
Unfortunately, because white supremacy is so deeply ingrained in all of the fabrics and institutions of the United States, even those folks who have pure and earnest hearts, who mean very well, start from some belief systems that are rooted in white supremacy. And so our media in the United States, those folks who want to be at their best, are still in many ways regurgitating some of the issues and challenges that we face in regards to tearing down hate and having a better understanding of our fellow person. As your panelist from Canada said earlier, if we minimize those Asian American women who may profess have labor in sex work, and we kick them out of this conversation in a different space, now we're not doing the work to ensure justice for all people, because sex workers are still people, people who deserve justice. And so if we're going to have language around how to treat people more fairly and in a more just way, we cannot castigate certain people for certain types of labor, whether they be Asian or otherwise.
But the problem, you keep saying white supremacists. The problem is, how can you determine who is a white supremacist? It's an idea in somebody's mind. You cannot legally define who is a white supremacist.
I would push back to only say it's not so much an idea in someone's mind, it is a concept that guides the way that we organize our society. What we mean by that is an example of this. The United States Department of Agriculture, for years, decades, almost a half century, has routinely denied loans to Latin American farmers, to Black American farmers, to Asian American farmers in the same ways as they have approved loans for white Americans. That is not an idea in someone's mind. That is an operation of doing practice. There have been red lines in various communities in the United States. Home ownership is the #1 indicator of wealth. If we're going to redline and devalue certain homes and properties because of who lives in a community, that's not an idea in someone's mind. That is a philosophy and concept that guides the way that we employ public policy. So what we must do is create public policy that is not guided and dictated by the philosophy of white superiority.
And Sheena, this question also has a historical context, I presume. In what ways do you think the racism against Asian Americans is also a product of history and a reflection of the contemporary reality because of the economic, social, and cultural backgrounds of Asian Americans?
Yeah, I mean,
for example, they are
as long as-
employed in certain industries, and they were considered stereotypes. Some of the cultural factors, they're more docile and silent. Does that also contribute to what happened to them?
For sure. I mean, you know, how we're brought up, we're always brought up to be silent, never to make any noise, to just stay in the background. And because of that, you know, we're not taken seriously in leadership roles. Even if we ask for a raise, we don't get it. We get an equal pay. We're not treated fairly. We also get harassed because they think we're silent, we're not going to say anything, right? Every time we get targeted for all these things, and because of that model minority myth, because we've been taught to never make any noise, stay in the background, just stay in your lane, just do as you're told. And so this is why it's so important for us to speak up when something happens, because we still get shamed for something even though it's not our fault, right? Something bad happens to us, it's like, don't say anything, we don't want to tarnish the family name, we don't want any trouble, but every time we stay silent, it really hurts us. We end up being the target. I've talked to so many women who've been target of sexual harassment cases where, you know, they talk to their HR department, nothing ever happens. And because of that, they end up not wanting to talk about it because nothing ever happens. And this happens a lot more than we realize, and we really need to just keep speaking up. And I know it's a long road ahead, and we have so many obstacles to overcome, but the more we can just keep on speaking up for our community, keep on speaking up for our Asian women, the more we can create that change.
So,
and
Mr.
it doesn't
Liu,
happen overnight.
Do you think this is a moment of reckoning for Asian people, Asian Americans? They have come out in large numbers, including you, to protest against this. Will this be a game changer?
I think to a certain extent it is a game changer, and particularly Chinese Americans. You know, I was so heartened to see so many of my friends, you know, people I don't know in Atlanta community, you know, they showed up with their kids, they showed up with their relatives, with their friends at the Liberty Square right across from capital of Georgia State and marched to the CNN. You know, usually most of the Chinese Americans, they tend to take care of their own business, you know, about their children, about, you know, their investment. But for the first time, I think they descended upon the square, you know, en masse to show that they are with those that were killed, to demonstrate to their representatives that there is deeply seated racism against them, and they want to make their position very clear.
So in a way, Asian Americans, like any Americans, deserve to feel safe on the streets, right?
It is, of course. You know, we are Americans, and we should be treated like all Americans, including white Americans. And if we're not treated that way, then there is a problem with the government, there is a problem with the society, and that has to be corrected. And we're part of that correction.
And Ray, some final thoughts. Do you think America is moving in the right direction to tackle the racial inequality problem?
One of the things that I like about the work that I and those I'm in community with do is that we don't worry about whether or not this is a question of, is America doing right? Are we getting justice as Americans? We worry about the question of, are we getting justice as human beings? As humans, is this a human rights question? One of the leaders and thinkers that I learned from is Malcolm X, and he talked all the time prior to his assassination about the need to take the crimes against African Americans to the United Nations, because this is a human rights question.
Thank you very much, Ray. Thank you, Sheena. Thank you, Mr. Liu. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhu in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.